The majority of our cases are coming from district attorneys who identify as progressive prosecutors. Many of them have received funding from a Soros or Soros interest. They take almost like a blood oath that they will stop prosecuting criminals and start prosecuting cops. Occasionally, we'll have a case that, quite surprisingly, does not end in acquittal. And one of those cases, I'll tell you, is one of our it's still a current case, and it will be a current case until this officer, his name is cleared. Even though he's been convicted, I mean, it is an unjust conviction. I believe that with every fiber of my being. And that's the case of Eric DeValkenaere, who's a Kansas City, Missouri police officer who was, the last year, found guilty in a shooting case in which a person pulled a gun on Eric and his partner, and Eric used deadly force. Long story short, he sits in prison right now. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison. He's serving his sentence as we speak. Eric didn't do a single thing wrong. Some of these officers, their employment is terminated, even though they didn't do anything wrong. They're a victim of having been involved in a case that generated a lot of public outcry, and that's it. And that could happen to any police officer at any time. That's why this is important. This is a low-speed following. There was no reason for anyone to think it was going to result in anyone's death. And in fact, until Karan pulled directly in front of a car that was traveling, a 90-degree angle to him, there was no reason to think anyone was going to die. If you look at it from a larger perspective, every police officer across 18,000 law enforcement organizations that are actually still working, still have to put on a uniform and go to work, they're paying attention to what the outcomes are for these guys, and they're making the connection that if you go out and you work hard and you do your job, sometimes that results in bad things happening to you. Larger picture, we have to be concerned about moving forward as a profession, as a law enforcement profession. Will it be able to continue to serve the way it has in the past when there's this sort of elephant in the room is that you might be prosecuted or you might lose your job even though you didn't do anything.
Hello, America. Welcome to Your Leo Nation. I am the Chief Mark Garrett, and you know that here, Your Leo Nation, we believe in and support the rule of law. Without the rule of law, we have chaos, kind of like in the old Get Smart series from the 1960s that I loved watching, but it really does become chaos if we don't have the rule of law. And there's nothing more important than fighting for it in any way that you can to support the rule of law. And if you can't be a fighter, not everybody can. I'm doing what little part that I can with this podcast, getting the word out, supporting our men and women in law enforcement. But if you can't be a fighter, you certainly can support those who do fight for the rule of law and who do fight for the men and women who enforce the rule of law. And we are absolutely privileged today to have one of those leaders in that capacity on with us today, and that is Jason C. Johnson, the president of the Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund. Jason, good morning, and thank you so much for being a part of the show today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Mark. It's a privilege to be able to come on with you and talk about the work that we do, and again, defending the rule of law.
Yep. Well, I've been a supporter of your foundation for quite some time, and quite frankly, even though I remember a case we're going to talk about later on, but it's because, I do support the foundation that I was reminded recently of the case. And it's one of the reasons that I reached out to you and you so graciously agreed to be on the show today. But before we get into that, and it is an important case, and it's one for a lot of reasons that really strike home with me coming from the California Highway Patrol and some of the aspects that are common. I want to talk about you a little bit. I want you to tell us a little bit about yourself, and I really want you to talk about in general about the Legal Defense Fund, and I think about 30 years old now, and how it got established and what you guys do in general.
Yeah, I'd love to, and it's one of the things I really like to talk about almost more than just about anything else. So I'll say a little bit about myself toward the end of this, but the Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund, which of course is the organization that I lead, has been around for about 30 years, and it was started by some former Reagan administration officials. Ed Meese, who of course was attorney general during the Reagan administration, and who remains on our board of directors as an integral part of our organization, has helped develop it to what it is now. So Ed, along with Al Regnery, and an attorney and another attorney that were in the Reagan Justice Department named David Martin, who has since passed away, got together and started the Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund, because even in the 90s, I guess it was the early 90s at the time, they could see a move toward prosecuting law enforcement officers in cases where it wasn't just to do so, but the charges were being pursued merely for, political ends. And that really is what the Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund has focused on for its 30 years, is finding cases in which a law enforcement officer has been charged with a crime related to the officer's work, in which the charges were not just, and they would not have been brought against someone who was not a law enforcement officer, and they were brought for political gain for the elected prosecutor or whoever it was that in fact brought the charges. And so that's been a mainstay for what we've done, and we've done it for countless officers over that time. Currently we have over 10 officers that we're supporting. We just completed the third back-to-back trial of an officer that we supported. And that's what we do. So we raise money to be able to pay the legal defense costs of these officers. And, there are some police officers that are in the fortunate position that the departments and the jurisdictions in which they work, they have a union or some other organization that has the financial resources to support legal defense of officers in that position. But there are many, many, and, there are 18,000 police departments across our country. And so there are many officers that work in smaller departments or departments that don't have that luxury. And they look, and in order, they have basically two options. They can sell their house, bankrupt themselves, and then still need more money to be able to hire legal counsel, or they can turn to an organization like ours. And we have just so many thousands of dedicated law enforcement supporters who contribute to the cases that we support and have done so over our 30 years. And that's put us in this great position where we do have funds available. We're able to support deserving officers' legal defense. So that's the main part of our work, Mark. We also have a growing mission in just informing the public on critical issues around criminal justice. And, just recently, some of the topics we've done in-depth professional research projects on related to progressive prosecutors, prosecutors that are funded by primarily Soros or Soros interests. We've looked at both the campaign finance issues. We've looked at the effectiveness or lack of effectiveness of Soros prosecutors. We've looked at the police recruiting crisis. Right now, we're looking at some of the impacts, and this might be of particular interest to you, Mark, with your CHP background, is that we're looking at the impact on traffic safety from depolicing. So the depolicing we've seen since, really 2020, I think, mid 2020, that has been a result of some defunding, but more than defunding, it's just been demoralization and a staffing crisis really in law enforcement that has reduced traffic enforcement significantly.
It's such a great, an interesting point that you bring up, Jason, about the defunding having an impact on traffic safety. I spoke about this probably more than a few times on the show, specifically, of course, how it relates to California and California Highway Patrol, because Gavin Newsom has, to a large extent, used the CHP as a political pawn to move officers around from their primary role, responsibility of traffic safety, into local jurisdictions that are on fire, quite frankly, on fire, Oakland being one of them, for an example. And I said, there's no way this cannot have a negative effect on traffic safety if you're taking the primary traffic enforcement agency out of that role to some extent, moving resources to another jurisdiction to fight crime that, quite frankly, your and your ilk's policies are responsible for, Gavin Newsom. And then, of course, what kills more people in this country more, at a higher rate than anything else is traffic collisions. About, 40,000, give or take, on the year every year are killed in this country in traffic collisions. How anybody dies unjustly is obviously always a tragedy. But the point for law enforcement is to save lives, to prevent deaths. And however somebody's dying is a tragedy. And when you do this, it's going to have negative results. And I think we're seeing that in California. So I'm so glad that you bring that up, So speaking of California and then in LELDF, or in your role, and it's probably a kind of a softball question. I apologize. But
I
I
fish a
have to
lot
ask
of
it.
softball
Yeah,
questions.
I have to ask it. You guys operate like obviously anywhere if the need exists that you can help. Do you find certain states, certain jurisdictions, and you mentioned the George Soros whack job DAs, this is why it's softball, but do you find certain states or certain jurisdictions more likely to engage in, I think, what you and I would call unjustified prosecutions of law enforcement officers?
I can't pin it down at a particular jurisdiction, but just can say that the majority of our cases are coming from district attorneys who identify as progressive prosecutors.
Mhm.
Many of them have received funding from a Soros or Soros interest. Some of them have not received any direct funding, but they're like part of the club. So if you and if any of your listeners or viewers want to look at our website at policedefense.org, we've got a couple of research projects that are directed specifically toward this progressive prosecutor issue. And so it'll illuminate who those prosecutors are. We actually have an interactive map now that you can go to. It'll have
Mhm.
dot as a map of the United States. It'll have a series of dots throughout, the country. If you hover over one of those dots, it'll show you who the district attorney is there and what their ties are to Soros interests. Very detailed campaign finance information and some news stories also about that get more toward their performance as prosecutors. So essentially, Soros prosecutors are, we'll just call them generally progressive prosecutors. They take almost like a blood oath that they will stop prosecuting criminals and start prosecuting cops. That's pretty much, in its simplest form is what they do. And so, of course, the net effect of that is that we see an increase in prosecutions of law enforcement officers. And so, even in cases where, objectively, a regular citizen, not even, we certainly come at this with certain baggage or biases that some might say are in favor of law enforcement. But even if you put a group of average normal citizens in a room who don't have any particular affinity for law enforcement, but also aren't necessarily against law enforcement, could look at some of these cases and be like, this is not a criminal case. The officer didn't do anything wrong. And that's what we're seeing from juries in these cases. They're making it to juries and juries are saying no. 3 back-to-back cases for us. But I'll tell you, to answer your question as specifically as I can, the
Mhm.
biggest issue we're seeing is coming out of Austin, Texas. Believe it or not,
Interesting.
state of Texas, but it is Austin, so it's special. So Travis County, Texas, the prosecutor there is a guy named Jose Garza. He is a Soros prosecutor, and he has, I think, with reckless abandon, gone after law enforcement officers, really for no reason other than they're cops, and it's very obvious. So I think, and again, it's a little bit of subjectivity here, but I think of any jurisdiction in the country, that the jurisdiction in which an officer is most likely to be prosecuted is Travis County, Texas.
See, this is fascinating. I was just reading, totally unrelated from law enforcement this morning. I was reading an article about not only Austin, Texas, but some other jurisdictions, other cities around the country. And whether it's in Alabama, Georgia, Texas, Oregon, California, Wisconsin. And again, the states, of course, were kind of distributed between conservative and liberal, blue, red, whatever you want to call it, states. But the cities all had one thing in common, that they were very blue. And again, it was non-law enforcement related, but it certainly was a progressive policy that I was looking at. And I was thinking about even in some of these very heavily conservative states, you still have these pockets of progressivism, progressive DAs, progressive city councils that can still have a terrible effect on public policy and on public safety. And when you're prosecuting cops at a higher rate than you are criminals, then I think it's pretty straightforward. You're going to have a negative impact on public safety. So speaking of those, you talked about 3 cases, in a row about successes over, a given period of time, the 30 years or last decade or whatever time frame you might want to rely on just for conversation. What is your success rate when you take on a particular case? Obviously, you can't nor should you just take on every case where a cop is prosecuted, because the truth is sometimes cops need to be prosecuted. They should be prosecuted. They should be imprisoned. But those cases, I think, from my experience and just reading, are pretty rare. What is your success rate as far as acquittals or reversals or, mitigation of findings, things like this with the cases that you take on?
Yeah, our success rate is, I can't give you a firm number on it, but it's good. I mean,
Mhm.
most of our cases end in an acquittal for the officer
Yeah.
that we're supporting. Occasionally, we'll have a case that, quite surprisingly, does not end in acquittal. And one of those cases, I'll tell you, is one of our actual, it's still a current case, and it will be a current case until this officer, his name is cleared. Even though he's been convicted, I mean, it is an unjust conviction. And I believe that with every fiber of my being. And that's the case of Eric DeValkenaere, who's a Kansas City, Missouri police officer who was, in the last year, found guilty in a shooting case in which a person pulled a gun on Eric and his partner, and Eric used deadly force. And it's probably goes beyond the scope of our conversation here. What the reason why his case ended in a conviction? It was a bench trial. It was not a jury trial.
Mhm.
Many law enforcement officers will select a bench trial to help try to avoid, the bias they feel that some communities may have against law enforcement, especially at times like now, and particularly back in, 2020, 2021. And Eric elected a bench trial, and that didn't seem like a bad idea at the time. But unfortunately, the consequences to him have been devastating. And he was found guilty by a judge. And I um, still can't figure out why, you know, and there are legal explanations for it, but I just don't think they carry any water. So right now, we've really turned our effort toward seeking a pardon by the governor of Missouri, Governor Parson, who is a former sheriff, and he is not seeking reelection. His term will end at the end of this year, and this is it is a very high profile case, so it is putting some pressure on the governor. There are many on our side who are calling for a pardon or sentence commutation, and then there are people on the other side of the issue that they're asking the governor not to do that. But that's where we're putting our efforts right now. Eric, long story short, he sits in prison right now. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison. He's serving his sentence as we speak. His wife, Sarah, who's been outspoken in support, doing everything she possibly can to clear her husband's name. She's raising their children while he's in prison. She's a kindergarten teacher. She's just both Eric and Sarah, their family, they're wonderful people. Eric didn't do a single thing wrong. And I invite all of your listeners to just, check out our website or any other source to learn a bit more about Eric's case. But, you asked about what our record is, and our record is very good. But the one exception that keeps me up at night is Eric DeValkenaere.
Yeah, I bet. And I'm gonna check that out. Speaking of websites, a couple of minutes ago, you talked about the mapping that you do with the red dots, whatever. Can you give the website again? And if you guys there in the background can link that to our website, because I would listen, it's a tool that I'm going to use. It's a tool that I'm going to use as much as I support you guys every month. I haven't used that. So what's that website again, Jason?
Yeah, it's policedefense.org is our website. And then from there, we have resources for the cases that we are supporting and have supported, and as well as information about some of our research that I've referenced a couple of times about Soros DAs or police consent decrees or the police staffing crisis and so on. We aim for once a quarter putting out a major research project that we put a lot of work into and are frankly very proud of. And they're policing issues and just larger criminal justice issues, separate and apart from the individual cases that we support. And all of that information is available on our website.
Fantastic. And we're certainly going to plug the website again, before we part ways today. But I encourage everybody right now, if you're listening to this podcast, if you're watching the podcast, pause it. Go to the website, sign up for auto pay every month. And whether it's $5 a month, guys, that's half a cup of coffee at Starbucks. And it goes to a much better cause. So if you believe in the rule of law, if you believe in this horrible wave of anti-cop mentality, do something. Do something like I chose 2 years ago. Support the fund right now, and be one of those people who support the people who are actually in the front lines fighting. Jason, speaking of the actual fighters, I'm kind of curious, if it's not top secret, but how many lawyers do you have on staff, or is this a contract kind of thing? What does your team of lawyers actually look like?
Yeah. The team of lawyers is me, but we don't actually directly represent anyone. I'll tell you, 99+% of the cases that we get involved in, when we first have direct contact with the officer involved or their attorney, the attorney's already been retained. So the officer has selected their own legal counsel through the normal means, whether they got referred to that attorney or however they were. What I've come to find, and I guess I kind of knew this before I got involved in the role, is that, there are attorneys that really focus on police issues. And so probably half of our cases for the jurisdiction where the officer works, it's that attorney who already has contractual arrangements with the police union or FOP or police association. And so they're already sort of a known quantity. They already understand the police use of force, the law around police use of force, and they're inclined to represent police officers. And so probably half of the cases are that. And then the other half is just general criminal defense lawyers who don't necessarily have any particular experience representing police, but have vast experience representing people charged with crimes. But rarely is the case where we're actually involved in making that, sort of matchmaking between the officer and attorney. Those relationships usually already exist. Our role is just to come in, get involved to the extent we can. I mean, there are some times where we're able to make connections with expert witnesses that we've used in the past that are experienced in the area of police use of force, in the Fourth Amendment body of case law that surrounds police use of force. So we can sometimes make those connections. But in every case, our real role is to raise money to support the legal defense of the officer and then cover everything we possibly can, whether they are attorney's fees, expert witness fees, jury consultants, you name it. Litigation is expensive. It has, many components to it. And we're just able, when we're able to cover all of the expenses, which has been every case that I'm aware of, and certainly in my 5+ years here, we've covered every expense of every case, minus any, sometimes there's some insurance involved where the officer has some legal insurance that they can tap into, or the union offers a certain coverage. And so when that is the case, that obviously the insurance payor pays first, and then there's always supplemental costs that we're involved in. And that's our main role is sort of bankrolling these cases so that there is no or minimal financial impact on the officer and their family. That's our goal.
Well, it's great. I'm glad you clarified that. But obviously the finances, the resources, and quite frankly, the moral support you guys provide it's beyond essential. I guess if you can overstate the word essential, it's what it is. And, I listened to you speak. I came from management, by the time I retired, top management from the CHP. And so dealing with unions and attorneys from all over the place is something I'm very familiar with. And, I can tell you are too. And I think not just from your time with the defense fund you're with now, but of course you spent time in law enforcement. Is that right? Mm-hmm.
So I spent the first, couple decades of my career in Prince George's County, Maryland, which is the county that comprises basically the eastern side of the District of Columbia. So it's a suburb of the District of Columbia. It's a major county. It's a population is well over 1 million. It's a very diverse, racially, ethnically, and otherwise diverse county. And it was a great place to work. I really enjoyed my career there. And my final role there was I retired as the commander of internal affairs, which gave me, quite a lot of exposure to not only internal investigations of police officers, but in particular force investigations, officer involved shootings, in custody deaths, and other serious uses of force. My units within my portfolio were responsible for those investigations and reviews and so forth. So that's what gave me, I think a pretty good background in looking at these cases and understanding how to approach them and exactly how to sort of separate those cases, which, as you indicated, not every police use of force case is justifiable. There are situations where there are many situations in which the officer's performance could have been better, that it wasn't a policy violation. It certainly wasn't a crime, but there's things we could learn to improve on in the future. And so that's important. But then also it's important to identify cases where what the officer did was frankly just wrong, either a violation of policy or even in some cases, even a crime. Those cases are rare, but they do exist. And it's important to be able to learn to tell the difference. And that's one thing that unfortunately, like so many things in our society, that people are very polarized. They sort of come at these incidents of a police use of force with their own bias, very much ingrained in their own bias. Sometimes people are very pro law enforcement, which I like, but sometimes they can't even see when something is wrong because of that bias. And then on the other side of the spectrum, there are people who are just going to be against the police no matter what. And so it seems that no matter how much you try to emphasize the facts and reviewing the facts and making sure that we're careful about not jumping to a conclusion, but waiting until the evidence comes in. Sort of the other side will take a 5-second video clip and be 100% confident that the officer was wrong and should be in jail. And unfortunately, that has increasingly, when the activists on that side pressure prosecutors, that results in the types of cases that we then become involved in. So I like to think that, given my background, and when I finished in that role, I was for a couple of years, I was in Baltimore as a deputy police commissioner in the wake of the death of Freddie Gray, which was a very high profile allegation of police misconduct, but it was also an example of prosecutorial overstep. The prosecutor at the time, who's since been voted out of office and has been now twice convicted of different forms of public corruption, rushed to charge Baltimore police officers that were involved in the arrest and transportation of Freddie Gray, even though there really wasn't any evidence that any of them did anything wrong. It was to assuage a growing mob of people who were demanding that they be charged. And so she pressed forward without evidence, and the officers were all acquitted or had their charges dropped.
After, of course, they've gone through this beyond imagination level of stress, their names are submerged, many ruined professionally for life. Yeah. So, yeah, everything's fine now that she got, and this is not about you. I'm just talking about what the mob can do. There's no problem to go out and ruin people's lives just to go ahead and get satiated with your political appetite. So,
and that's a good point, Mark, because I'll stop you there just for a second, because people don't realize that even though these cases, and we talked earlier about our cases generally resulting in favorable outcomes for the officers, that just means it resulted in a favorable outcome in their criminal case. It doesn't mean that we were able to win over the court of public opinion, or that these officers don't face unfair and unjust results at work, in terms of their employment. Some of these officers, their employment is terminated, even though they didn't do anything wrong. They're a victim of having been involved in a case that generated a lot of public outcry, and that's it. Yep. And that could happen to any police officer at any time. That's why this is important, because it's as important, obviously our work is directed toward these individual officers and their families. But if you look at it from a larger perspective, every police officer across 18,000 law enforcement organizations that are actually still working, still have to put on a uniform and go to work, they're paying attention to what the outcomes are for these guys. And they're making the connection that if you go out and you work hard and you do your job, sometimes that results in bad things happening to you. People talk about the danger of policing. These officers, they understand the dangers of it, and they go and do it anyway. The physical danger is not something that's going to prevent them from doing their job. What will prevent them from doing their job is the concern over being unjustly singled out, prosecuted, face employment related consequences to the work that they do when they haven't done anything wrong. And I think that's even though we're focused on the individual officers and their families, and I think rightfully so, I think in a larger picture, we have to be concerned about moving forward as a profession, as a law enforcement profession. Will it be able to continue to serve the way it has in the past, when there's this sort of elephant in the room, is that you might be prosecuted, or you might lose your job, even though you didn't do anything wrong?
Well, I think that we are seeing the results of that attitude right now. There's no doubt about it. We're seeing what happens. I think, the answer to your question is we know what it is. And when public opinion is, well, we'll say some public opinion, and we'll certainly say the opinions of these rogue prosecutors, when their focus is to persecute officers who haven't done anything wrong, is certainly going to dissuade people from signing up for the job. We see it in recruitment, we see it in morale, and we see it in crime stats. You've hit on so many important topics. I think just talking to you so far, Jason, we could probably do 3 separate shows, just some things we've talked about in these first 30 minutes in depth. A couple of things you did talk about. You talked about, because you were retired as the commander of Internal Affairs Unit with St. George, right? Is that what?
Prince George's. Yeah.
I said St. George.
You have a royal title.
Prince, and I know, the other one. The other. Prince George, and I know Prince George. And also, violations of policy versus criminal behavior. And I, again, very steep in this, as you are, I am, with the CHP. So that brings us to this case that I want to focus on right now, on the last part of the show today. And that's the prosecution of Officer Terrence Sutton. And you know what, with that, I'll just stop right there because you are the expert in this. I'm going to let you just talk about the overview. We'll maybe get into a little discussion about it. So take it from there.
So it's late 2020, and everybody remembers what 2020 was like between COVID and, police hysteria. There was a lot of police hysteria beginning in the middle of 2020 after the death of George Floyd that resulted in a lot of bad decision making, a lot of bad legislative decision making, and a lot of bad prosecutorial decision making. And the case I'm getting ready to describe is a great example, I think, of the latter. And so Terrence Sutton, a decorated 13-year veteran of the Metropolitan Police Department, which of course is the DC Police. They're called the Metropolitan Police Department of the District of Columbia. He had been worked there, like I said, for 13 years, had never been in any trouble, had worked in more or less the same community his whole career, same district and same community, had developed an excellent reputation as a hardworking cop who was effective, but also maintain good relationships in the community. So it's really what people in the community talk about what kind of police officer they really want. This is who it was. Terrence Sutton is who it is. He's never been in trouble. He's a hard worker. He loves the community. He loves his job, but he's willing to go out and do the job. So he's not one of these guys who just kind of hangs around and waits for somebody else to go find the bad guys. He's going and finding the bad guys and doing his job. So there is a street gang in this community that Terrence is very familiar with, had arrested most of the members at some point of this gang, and had arrested one particular person, several times in the past. And even beyond the arrest, had also interacted with him many times when there was no arrest, and had maintained really a pretty, you know how it is on the street. You got the hardworking police officers and you got the people who are criminals, and they know each other and they interact from time to time. And there's it's not that they're mad at each other, but they kind of both have a job to do, right?
Yeah.
And Terrence was doing his job as a cop, and his job is to prevent violent crime. Gangs are engaged in violent crime. His job is to go out and stop it. And he took that job very seriously. I can tell you that. So, and the young man's name is Karan, is the name. Then just so as I'm referring to him, it'll make sense. But Terrence is working one day, and he worked in a like an anti-crime unit, or most urban departments have. They go by different names. So they're basically street crime units. They're the hard charging cops, the ones that aren't afraid to go out. They know who the criminals are. They've proven in the past that they are able to prevent crime by the work that they do. Terrence is one of those guys. He's working one day, again, is late in 2020. He finds out that Karan, who's a known gang member, was in a particular area on a sort of a moped, motor scooter, I guess, type vehicle. And there had been a belief by the police department intelligence that Karan had been owed money by someone in the community that he had visited, that he was maybe looking for someone to get even with, or to, if he's owed money, he's going to go collect on the money. So Terrence Sutton is looking for him and sees him, and he's operating this scooter moped, and he's doing it without a helmet, and he's on the sidewalk. Both of those are violations of the DC law. So that gives Terrence the probable cause he needs to go ahead and stop Karan, which he does. He attempts to do. He turns his emergency lights on, and Karan takes off.
And Jason, I want to interject because the probable cause is so important. There's reason for him to engage in an enforcement contact. But before that, and you're the law expert here, but to my understanding, he had reasonable suspicion to contact him in the first place. Would that be fair to say?
I think it's fair to say he had both reasonable suspicion because of his understanding that Karan might come to or had been in that area, and there was a reason for it, that he might be there to locate someone that owes him money.
Great. I wanted to get that out there.
Yes. So, and also, I would add that, there's a little bit more to it, because Karan is known to be armed at times, and he has been arrested by Sutton before for both guns and drugs and other, things that help give rise to that reasonable suspicion that not only is in the area potentially for a nefarious purpose, but also he might be armed. But then on top of that, he actually commits a traffic violation in the presence of a Metropolitan police officer, which really trumps any argument that whether there was or wasn't reasonable suspicion. He certainly did commit a traffic violation. And so that gives a rock solid reason for Terrence Sutton to attempt to pull him over, which is what he tried to do. But Karan took off, and, of course, he's not driving a car. He's driving a scooter. Scooter will only go 30 miles an hour plus or minus. So it's This is not a, like a high speed pursuit or anything like that. Karan drives around, does not stop for Sutton. Sutton stays behind him with his lights on most of the time. And Karan's not stopping. It lasts about 3 minutes of this 30-mile-an-hour plus or minus following, if you will. And at some point, Karan pulls through a blind alley, pulls through an alleyway and then out into a pretty main street that has a lot of traffic. And he pulls out into it blindly without stopping or, yielding any right away. And he gets hit by a civilian vehicle who was not, not a police vehicle, not involved in any way in this police activity. And it was absolutely not struck by Terrence Sutton or any other police car. So I think that's important, because when people passively listen to the story, I think they assume that Terrence Sutton somehow contacted Karan's motor scooter or was somehow involved in this collision. He was not. And that is important. He was absolutely not involved in any sort of collision. And again, this whole thing was at very low speed. Well, tragically, Karan dies as a result of this collision. And only weeks after that, the United States Attorney for the District of Columbia brought murder charges against Terrence Sutton. So it wasn't, not that this would have been right, but it wasn't reckless driving or anything like that. It was murder. He's charged with murder and was unfortunately and very surprisingly convicted of murder after a jury trial in the District of Columbia that lasted about 3 months, 2.5 to 3 months. And so that's kind of where we are. I mean, as a quick overview of this case, and we could probably do several episodes just on this case, but
yes, we
that's
could.
That's my quick overview of what happened and sort of how the case got to us.
So let me back up a little bit. A couple of things, not back up, but again, you hit on so many important points. I want to clarify for the audience and for myself. This was a pursuit, and my understanding is that under these circumstances, the Metro Police Department did not allow officers to engage in pursuits. Is that a fair representation of their policy?
Yes, they have a restricted pursuit policy. It's actually a little less restrictive now than it was at the time. I think the District of Columbia has realized they might need to allow their police officers a little bit more leeway. But nevertheless, they still have a restricted, and they had an even more restrictive policy back then. I think it is fair to describe this activity as a pursuit. I mean, we can quibble over the legal technicalities, but I think it's fair to describe it that way, although I wouldn't necessarily concede that point if we were debating about it, just because of the speed involved and the fact that, no one really had to exceed the maximum posted speed limit in this activity. Now, was Karan trying to get away? Yeah, I'm sure he would have liked to get away, but he did stay in roughly the same area. So, yeah, I'll take your point. Like if someone says this was pursuit, it was a pursuit, I'll accept that. And I'll even accept if someone says what happened violated the District of Columbia Police Department's, the Metropolitan Police Department's pursuit policy. Although I think we could debate that, even if you accept that as factual. I think where you're heading with this is there's a far cry from a technical policy violation and a criminal charge, and even further divide between a technical policy violation and a murder charge for this incident in which, this collision that Terrence Sutton had no involvement in.
Yeah. And again, this is such a meaty topic and case specifically, case more than topic, for the reasons that you articulated about the differences between, a pursuit. In other words, there's some jurisdictions, based on what I read about this incident and the way you described it, which are very consistent, that would call this a failure to yield on the part of the suspect, that it wasn't a pursuit. This person simply wasn't stopping for the lights and sirens. They're tooling around, just not yielding, and which is a big difference, a technical difference in a lot of jurisdictions. One of the other aspects that, again, with my background that I look at, obviously there had to be a traffic collision investigation involving the civilian that hit the suspect. Is that correct? Does an investigation exist separate about that?
Sure.
Okay. Yeah. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that they've probably found the suspect at fault in the collision. Am I wrong? I hope I'm not wrong. I hope I'm not wrong on this one.
Well, he certainly was at fault in the collision. I mean, he failed to yield. He failed to yield the right of way to a car that was just traveling down the street and had the right to travel down the street, and he pulled in front of it. So he certainly was at fault in the collision.
So the thing is, if had there not been a police officer involved and everything else had happened exactly the way that he did, he had entered into an intersection or a roadway, a highway, and failed to yield to someone who had the right of way, and again, tragically died, he still would have been found at fault in that traffic collision, at fault, his fault. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that is fair to
Okay.
say.
I felt like I'm interrogating you, but
You're
I
right.
want people to understand the word fault. So you have a separate civil investigation to a traffic collision that's part of a larger criminal investigation, but the traffic collision investigation resulted in finding the suspect at fault in his own death. This is so important for people to realize and to understand. Again, we can have policy violations, like you said, and that's where I was going, that don't mean that someone's actually in violation of any crime. Certainly doesn't mean that they should be convicted of murder. By the way, and feel free to get into the definite. I think it was second degree murder. Is that right?
It's second degree, what's called depraved heart murder.
Mhm.
Essentially, what the government had to prove to sustain a conviction was that, and I'm kind of oversimplifying this, of course, just for the interest of time, but
So
the
and so I can understand, but go ahead.
so so depraved heart murder requires a degree of recklessness that is, and again, the recklessness would be attributed to Officer Sutton. He's the defendant, so he would be the one who would engage in a sufficient degree of recklessness where that it almost was a disregard for human life, that level of recklessness. So that connotes a certain predictability that this activity, what is happening here, is likely to result in the death of, if not Quran, then someone else. When you and I both know, I mean, just from experience, that even if this is a pursuit, and again, I would argue the point a little bit, but even if a jury were to conclude, okay, this was a pursuit within the ordinary definition of a pursuit, and it, because of that, was violative of the Metropolitan Police policy, that wouldn't be enough. That is not enough to sustain a conviction of any crime, certainly not of murder. For the murder conviction, the jury had to find that there was a degree of recklessness that was almost to the point where Quran's death was predictable and was the natural consequences of this activity. So you can imagine a scenario where someone does something so reckless that it would support a murder conviction. For example, you shoot a gun into a crowd, maybe not targeting a specific person, but anyone would know if you shoot a gun into a crowd, there's a pretty good chance you're going to hit someone and they might die. I mean, that is a degree of recklessness that I think we could say, yeah, that does support a charge and maybe even a conviction for second degree murder. But applying that to the facts in this case, it doesn't fit. It doesn't fit at all. This is a low speed following. There was no reason for anyone to think it was going to result in anyone's death. And in fact, until Quran pulled directly in front of a car that was traveling, a 90-degree angle to him, there was no reason to think anyone was going to die. It was very short. It was very low speed. And it just wasn't even close to the degree of recklessness required to sustain a conviction for murder.
Yeah. I have to believe this is the product of the environment in which he was tried. Sorry, I have unfortunately over 30 years was made aware of a number of people, innocent people, who died in the commission of a pursuit, whether it was the agency I worked for or other agencies. It's fairly rare, but over 30 years, you hear about it and see them a number of times over that period. And there may have been an officer that was convicted of a crime, but I cannot remember. And I'm talking, these are 100-mile-an-hour pursuits. These are on surface streets, on freeways, county roads, through busy intersections where an officer probably was engaged in some egregious behavior in disregard for public safety. Those things happen. We all know that it happens from time to time. But I don't remember an officer being convicted of something of this degree. May have happened. I'm just saying what I recall. And the reason I say that is because this particular case struck me as aberrant, as absolutely unusual. I'm using that word, I think, lightly. This is not the norm. And I have to believe, and you set the context up very well early on, Jason, about the time frame that we're dealing with here in late 2020. We all know what was going on. We all knew what the sentiment was. We all know the images of Derek Chauvin. All those images were emboldened in everybody. Listen, whether you're pro law enforcement or not, everybody saw this. And the idea that you have 12 jurors in that particular jurisdiction and we know what the political makeup is in that jurisdiction where this guy was prosecuted, have to believe that this was not an objective observation and an objective deliberation on the facts. That's what I take away from the articles I've read about this case. And I know you feel the same way. I read a very heartfelt message from his mom, who actually, it came in the form of correspondence in my mail a couple of weeks ago. And that's what encouraged me to reach out to you. It's, you know what? I've really got to reach out to Jason about this because this is just hitting home with me right now. So anyway, with that little diatribe there, I got on. It's still out on bail. Is that right?
Yeah, he was convicted, and then subsequent to his conviction, there were a number of defense. You know, what happens in these criminal matters is that there are post-conviction motions and things that defense attorneys make, asking for a new trial and things of that nature, asking for relief other than upholding the conviction. And we've been through all of that, and the judge has declined to overturn the conviction, has declined to order a new trial. So what the posture we're in right now is, in June, there will be a sentencing hearing in which, you know, the government and the defense will have the opportunity to try to convince the court to use the federal sentencing guidelines in a way, you know, that benefits one side or the other. There's, you know, aggravating and mitigating factors here for the court to consider. The court has said he will not actually sentence Terrance on that day in June, but at some subsequent date. And so the next big thing, so at this point, we anticipate that the court will do that. The court will sentence Terrance most likely to a term of incarceration. The maximum I believe he's facing is up to 65 years in federal prison. And we don't expect that will be his sentence, but we don't know what he'll be sentenced to. So for us, I mean, I think that the next issues are to try to prevail upon the court and help the court understand it and see this case really for what it is. But there's going to be an appeal, and that's really where we are. We are 100% behind the appeal. Terrance has already retained counsel for the appeal. We, the LELDF, along with the Fraternal Order of Police that represents Terrance, are funding the appellate counsel. Our hope is that even after a sentence, that the court will grant what's called an appeal bond, so that Terrance can stay out of prison pending an appeal. I think this is a case where it's absolutely appropriate. Terrance is not a flight risk. He is not a public safety risk. And there's a fair probability that an appeals court, there are a number of issues in this case that are ripe for appeal. And I think the court should recognize that and allow him to stay out pending the appeal, which will probably take a year or so. And so that's that's kind of there will be a sentencing. We don't know how that will end up, but we really want Terrance to be able to stay out pending the appeal. And that's really what our hope is.
Yeah. And as is my hope. A couple of things. Why is it, you said 65 years. I did read that. I didn't remember it saying in federal prison. Why is this federal? It's not a civil rights violation claim, or is it?
It's not. It was brought under the DC murder statute, but the way the court system works in the District of Columbia is a little bit interesting because it is a federal enclave. So unlike charges that might be brought in a state, in California or in Maryland or in any other state, it's a little different in the district. There is a superior court that is it's like the trial court of general jurisdiction to enforce the DC code, criminal cases and civil cases. But they also have there's the federal district court of the District of Columbia. The case, and it's again, it gets a little bit beyond the scope probably of what we can cover today, but it's a little bit of I'm glad you pointed out, because it's a bit of an unusual course for a criminal case to take, even in the District of Columbia, for a criminal case that's not in which they're not alleging a violation of a federal statute, but they're alleging a violation of the code of the District of Columbia. It's unusual for it to be brought in federal court. And certainly there were arguments that jurisdiction was not proper. In this case, the court did not sustain any of those objections. So the case made it all the way through based on a charge against a law enforcement officer that's not based in the Constitution, in which it does not specifically allege a violation of anyone's Fourth Amendment rights or any other constitutional right. It simply alleges that Terrence Sutton engaged in reckless conduct, in which the degree of recklessness was sufficient to support a conviction under the DC Criminal Code murder charge. So it's unusual. It's not the normal course, but at this point, the court has, it's a course that's been accepted by the court, hasn't been kicked out of federal court, And right now, Terrance stands to be sentenced in federal court for this alleged local violation of the law.
That's a very interesting explanation. And I was curious when and heard that, but like I said, it, it's strange all the way around. The final thing I want to touch on, and you talked about the appeals, and pretty much nothing's been accepted on appeal or these procedural motions by the judge. I did read quite a bit about the alleged biased behavior of this judge, courtroom behavior. Again, this goes right back to the environment with which we are dealing with, going on 4 years ago here. Is that something that you can speak to? And are some of the reports from your point of view, are they accurate?
Um, I'm going to try to take a pass on that,
I got it.
only because his matter is still before the court.
Mhm.
And I don't want to say anything that would be harmful to Terrance. He deserves the best possible outcome here. And I certainly don't
Mhm.
want to contribute in any way to a bad outcome by offending anyone. And so I think I'll take a pass on that, and I'll let the other sources who have reported what happened in trial stand.
Well, listen, I certainly understand the diplomacy there and appreciate it as well. I, on the other hand, would encourage people to read as much about this case as possible and then draw your own conclusions. And beyond that, and really before that, I want to finish up here by again plugging the Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund. And I want you again, Jason, to provide any and all contact information that people can utilize. Guys back there in the background, producers, please link to the LED immediately. I want that up there on our website. And I want to remind everybody again, once Jason plugs it for the last time today, don't sit on the sidelines. If you are as disgusted as I am by rogue prosecutors, by unjust, immoral prosecutions of men and women who are out there trying to protect our communities and may do it sometimes in an imperfect way because we know they're human, but you're disgusted by the focused prosecution. And I think the unfair prosecution, please don't sit on the sidelines. Support people like Jason's organization. You don't have to be a fighter, but you damn well can be a supporter of the fighters. You can do it on the down low. You can do it anonymously, however you do it. But please do something. Don't bitch, moan, whine, complain, and then sit back on your hands and don't do a darn thing. So with that, Jason, plug one more time, and I want that to get out there and people to take advantage of all the contact information you can provide.
Thank you again, Mark, and thank you so much for having me on today. I really appreciate the opportunity. There are so many people out here across our great country, and I'm reminded of that constantly when we get the phone calls and the emails and the letters and the people contributing to most importantly, people contributing to the defense of these officers that we're supporting. So anything that your help to get us out there even more is really appreciated. Policedefense.org, and you will find on our website lots of information. So we have information about the cases and the officers that we're currently supporting. Many of the cases we have supported in the past with updates as to what the outcome was and any other additional updates. We've got a little bit of information on the studies that we've done and the reports that we've generated on a whole host of criminal justice and policing issues that are told, from our perspective, but you'll see we have the data to back up what we say in these reports and more. I mean, we even had videos. We have a use of force simulator. It's a virtual use of force simulator in which participants can watch a real body-worn camera video of real police activity, high-risk police activity, and we interpose questions that choose your own adventure, like, what would you do here? And the video freezes for a couple of seconds where you pick, would I use deadly force? Would I use a taser? Would I try to de-escalate more? What would you do? And it gives you feedback on whether your input was the correct one. And if it is, why? And if it's not, why? And so we're doing everything we can to try to bring information and support and really data to back up what we're saying on the larger criminal justice issues. And so I would invite anyone to visit our website, give us feedback. I'll even give out my email, my direct email, for anyone who wants to connect with me or us. I mean, we're a small organization, so I'm the president, but I'm one of 2 employees of our organization. So we're a very low drag, small organization that we like to think we're having a really a big impact, especially for the officers who really need our help. So my email is Jason, Jason, at LELDF.org. That's Jason at LELDF.org. And one more time, policedefense.org is our website.
Jason Johnson, thank you so much for being a part of the show today. It's been great. And by the way, it's been an education for me. And I'm looking forward to having you back on again, my friend. God bless you. And thanks for the tremendous work that you do.
Thank you. And thanks for the work you do, Mark.